A seat earned, a Marine stand at his son's graduation. The auditorium at Lincoln High School buzzed with anticipation on a warm June evening in suburban Virginia. Rows of folding chairs lined the gymnasium floor, filled with families dressed in their Sunday best, their voices a symphony of excitement and pride. For many, this was a night of celebration, a milestone marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. But for John Carter, a Black Marine veteran with 23 years of service, it was a moment he'd been dreaming of since his son, Nathan, was born. Nathan, the valedictorian of his class, would soon walk across the stage to accept his diploma, and John had chosen his seat carefully. Third row, center, perfect for capturing a clear photo of his boy's triumph. John's white button-down shirt, though faded at the collar, was pressed with military precision. His khaki pants, creased sharp enough to cut glass, bore the faint wear of years spent working as a carpenter. His calloused hands, scarred from battles he rarely spoke of, rested quietly on his knees. Around him, wealthier families chatted about Ivy League admissions and European vacations, their confidence a stark contrast to John's quiet dignity. He didn't join their conversations. He never did. His focus was on the stage, where Nathan would soon stand, the first in their family to graduate high school with such honors. Education had been a luxury John's family couldn't afford when he was young. The Marine Corps had given him discipline, purpose, and a way to provide for his son. But tonight, as he sat in the third row, a familiar unease crept in. Public events like this always carried a faint undercurrent of tension for him, not because of the crowds, but because of the way some people looked at him, a black man in worn clothes among the affluent. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the stage setup, the banners proclaiming Class of 2025. Then he noticed them. Two men in ill-fitting navy blazers approached the end of his row. Their laminated badges read, HOA Security, a detail that struck John as odd for a school event. The taller man, Harold Grayson, carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed a badge equaled authority. His partner, Edward Walsh, fidgeted with his tie, his eyes darting nervously. John's training kicked in, assessing them as a potential threat, not physical, but something else. Their body language screamed self-importance, and when Harold's gaze locked onto John, his jaw tightened. "Excuse me, sir," Harold said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "This section's reserved." John scanned the area. No signs, no ropes, no indication these seats were different from any others. "I don't see any signs," he replied, his tone calm, factual, neither confrontational nor submissive. Harold's eyes narrowed. "There should be," he snapped. Edward chimed in, his voice shaky. "These are premium seats. For VIP families." The word VIP hung in the air like a challenge. John's lips twitched with the irony. In 23 years of service, he'd learned to spot the difference between real authority and petty posturing. These men had none of the former. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back," Harold suggested, his tone dripping with condescension. John didn't move. He looked up at Harold, his eyes steady, the kind that had seen things these men couldn't fathom. "My son's the valedictorian," he said quietly. "I belong here." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Around them, families began to notice, their conversations fading as they watched the unfolding drama. Harold's face reddened, but before he could respond, an older man in the row behind John stood up. His silver hair and erect posture screamed military. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, his voice slicing through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The man introduced himself as Colonel Robert Hayes, retired Marine Corps. His presence shifted the dynamic, and Harold's bravado faltered. "This doesn't concern you," Harold said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It does," Colonel Hayes replied. "This man saved my life." The statement landed like a grenade, silencing the nearby crowd. Harold blinked, caught off guard, while Edward shifted uncomfortably. Colonel Hayes continued, his voice steady. "Kandahar, 2003. Our convoy hit an IED. I was trapped in a burning vehicle. 6 men tried to reach me. Only Staff Sergeant Carter got through, pulled me out with shrapnel in his neck and a dislocated shoulder." John's hand brushed the scar at the base of his throat, a reflex he barely noticed. The crowd's mood shifted, curiosity replaced irritation, and respect began to bloom. A young mother whispered to her husband, who now looked at John with newfound admiration. But Harold, clinging to his authority, doubled down. "Rules are rules," he said, his voice sharp. "Service or no service, this section's reserved." The tension thickened, and John remained seated, his posture unchanged. He'd faced worse than this, far worse. But as the crowd's attention grew, he felt the weight of their stares, an uncomfortable spotlight he'd spent years avoiding. The auditorium's atmosphere crackled with tension as Harold Grayson's words, "Rules are rules," hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. John Carter sat unmoving, his hands still resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the stage where his son, Nathan, would soon deliver his valedictorian speech. He'd faced ambushes in Fallujah, sniper fire in Ramadi, and worse, but this moment, with its petty indignity, stirred a different kind of unease. It wasn't about him, it was about Nathan, and John refused to let this moment be stolen from his son. Harold's face flushed with a mix of frustration and embarrassment as the crowd's attention intensified. Families in nearby rows leaned forward, their whispers fading into a hush. Edward Walsh, his partner, looked like he wanted to melt into the gymnasium floor, his fingers fumbling with his tie, as if it were a lifeline. The laminated HOA security badges they wore seemed flimsier by the second, their authority crumbling under the weight of Colonel Robert Hayes' revelation about John's heroism. Colonel Hayes stood tall, his silver hair catching the auditorium's fluorescent lights. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Harold. "You're telling a man who risked his life for this country that he can't sit in a folding chair at his son's graduation?" His voice was calm, but carried the edge of a man who'd commanded troops in chaos. "You might want to rethink that." Harold bristled, his pride stung. "Look, Colonel, we have orders. This section's for specific families." His tone was defiant, but a slight tremor betrayed his unease. Edward nodded weakly, his loyalty to Harold wavering as the crowd's disapproval grew palpable. A father, too, rose over, shook his head, muttering to his wife about disrespect. A teenage girl nearby pulled out her phone, discreetly recording the exchange. John remained silent, his training keeping him composed. He'd learned long ago that some fights were won by enduring, not escalating. His eyes flicked to the stage, where students were likely preparing, unaware of the drama unfolding in the third row. He wanted this over, not for his sake, but for Nathan's. This was his son's day, not a stage for old battles. But the situation was spiraling. Colonel Hayes' intervention had drawn more eyes, and now another figure approached from the auditorium's main entrance. The man moved with purpose, his charcoal suit tailored but understated, his stride that of someone who'd navigated war zones and boardrooms with equal ease. His eyes scanned the room, assessing the crowd, the layout, and the tension in the third row. When he spotted John, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, and he made a beeline for the group. Colonel Hayes noticed him first, raising a hand in a subtle salute. "Tom," he said, his voice carrying a warmth reserved for old comrades. The newcomer, Tom Sullivan, extended his hand to John as he reached the row. Tom Sullivan, former Navy SEAL. "We worked together in Fallujah." John stood, his first genuine smile of the evening breaking through. "Tom," he said, clasping Sullivan's hand. The handshake lingered, a silent acknowledgement of shared history, moments of life and death that bound them tighter than words could express. The crowd watched, sensing something profound in the exchange. "What brings you here?" John asked, his voice light but curious. "My niece is graduating," Sullivan replied, but his attention shifted to Harold and Edward. His gaze hardened, assessing them with the precision of a man trained to read threats. "But more importantly, this man," he nodded toward John, "pulled 3 of my teammates out of a burning building under sniper fire from 2 positions. I'd say he's earned any seat in this room." The crowd's reaction was immediate. A woman in the 5th row gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. An older man nodded, his expression shifting from annoyance to respect. The teenage girl with the phone zoomed in, capturing Sullivan's words. Harold's face reddened further, his authority eroding with every revelation. Edward, now visibly sweating, took a step back, his eyes darting between his partner and the growing circle of onlookers. "This is ridiculous," Harold snapped, his voice loud enough to carry to the back of the auditorium. "I don't care who he is. Rules are rules, and we're not backing down because of some washed-up soldier." The word soldier hit like a spark in dry grass. Colonel Hayes' face darkened, and Sullivan took a step closer to Harold, his posture suggesting he was seconds from losing patience. "Marine," Hayes corrected, his voice low but piercing. "Not soldier. Marine." The distinction mattered, especially to those who understood military culture. The crowd sensed it too. A murmur rippled through the auditorium. some nodding in agreement, others whispering explanations to their neighbors. John stood now, his 6 feet 2 inches frame unfolding with the controlled grace of a man who'd never let his training lapse. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the dynamic, making Harold seem smaller, his badge a flimsy shield against the quiet strength of a man who'd faced real danger. Edward tugged at Harold's sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. "Harold, maybe we should let this go. Find someone else to move." Harold shook him off, his pride fully engaged. "No," he hissed. "We're doing our job." But the auditorium doors swung open again, and 2 more men entered, their purposeful strides mirroring Sullivan's. One was stocky, with graying hair and broad shoulders that spoke of years of physical training. The other was leaner, his eyes scanning the room with the alertness of a predator. They spotted the commotion and exchanged a glance, their decision made without words. They moved toward John's row, their presence adding weight to an already charged situation. "Is that John Carter?" the stocky man called out, his Chicago accent thick. "Mike O'Connell, SEAL Team 5. Operation Red Dawn, remember?" John's smile returned, broader this time. "Mike," he said, shaking the man's hand. "Good to see you." The leaner man stepped forward. "Pete Larson," he introduced himself. "You saved my brother in Ramadi, 2005. He's told me the story 100 times, but I never thought I'd get to thank you in person." The testimonials came unprompted, each man adding to the narrative of John's courage. The crowd's attention was now fully locked on the 3rd row, parents standing to get a better view, students whispering about the hero in their midst. Harold's defiance wavered, his face pale as he realized he was losing control. "This is intimidation," he declared, his voice cracking. "I'm calling the police." Sullivan pulled out his phone, his eyes never leaving Harold. "You guys need to get down here," he said into the receiver. "It's John Carter." "Yeah, now." He hung up, his expression grim. "They'll be here in 5. The crowd buzzed, sensing the stakes rising. John, still standing, finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. "Gentlemen, this isn't necessary. I don't need anyone fighting for me." His words were directed at his fellow veterans, but they carried an authority that silenced the murmurs. He looked at Harold, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve that made the man flinch. "I just want to watch my son graduate." The auditorium at Lincoln High School was now a cauldron of anticipation, the air thick with the weight of John Carter's quiet defiance and the growing presence of his fellow veterans. John stood tall in the 3rd row, his 6 feet 2 inches frame a silent rebuke to Harold Grayson's faltering authority. The crowd, once distracted by their own conversations, was now riveted, their eyes darting between John, the veterans, and the 2 HOA security men who seemed increasingly out of their depth. Harold's threat to call the police hung in the air, but it was clear his bravado was crumbling under the scrutiny of the crowd and the undeniable gravitas of the men surrounding John. Colonel Robert Hayes, his silver hair gleaming under the auditorium lights, stood like a sentinel, his presence anchoring the group. Tom Sullivan, the former Navy SEAL, leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked on Harold with an intensity that made the smaller man shift uncomfortably. Mike O'Connell and Pete Larson, the newest arrivals, flanked John, their body language protective, their faces etched with the kind of loyalty forged in combat. The crowd's murmurs had softened to a tense hush, punctuated by the occasional whisper or the rustle of someone adjusting their seat for a better view. Harold's hand trembled as he reached for his phone, but before he could dial, the auditorium doors swung open again. 5 men entered as a unit, their movements synchronized, their eyes scanning the room with the precision of a tactical team. They were a mix of ages, some graying, others still carrying the lean muscle of their active duty days, but all bore the unmistakable mark of men who'd seen war. Their civilian clothes did little to hide their military bearing, and as they spotted the commotion in the 3rd row, they moved toward it with purpose. Sullivan waved them over, his gesture both urgent and relieved. "Over here, guys," he called, his voice cutting through the quiet. The crowd watched, some standing now, as the men approached. Harold's face paled further, his eyes darting between the newcomers and the veterans already present. Edward Walsh, his partner, looked like he might bolt, his HOA security badge dangling crookedly from his blazer. The leader of the new group, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard, spoke first. "John Carter," he said, his voice carrying a southern drawl. "Sam Bennett, Mosul, 2004. You saved my life when our patrol got ambushed outside the city." He clasped John's hand, his grip firm, his eyes steady with gratitude. Another stepped forward, younger, with a scar above his left eyebrow. Chris Morgan, Helmand Province. You carried me 3 miles to an evac point with a broken leg and insurgents on our tail. His voice was matter-of-fact, but the weight of his words landed heavily. A third, older, with gray at his temples, added, David Lee, Ramadi. You provided covering fire for our extraction when we were pinned down. Stayed behind to make sure we got out, then fought your way out alone. The testimonials poured out, unscripted but powerful, each man adding a piece to the mosaic of John's service. The crowd was spellbound, parents and students alike leaning forward, some with tears in their eyes. A teenage boy in the 5th row whispered to his mother, "Is that guy a superhero?" His mother shushed him, but her own expression was one of awe. John's discomfort was palpable. He shifted slightly, his hand brushing the scar at his throat again, a reflex born of memories he'd buried deep. He'd spent years avoiding this kind of attention, preferring the quiet life of a carpenter and father. But here, in this auditorium, his past was being laid bare, and he couldn't escape it. "Enough," he said finally, raising a hand to stop the flow of stories. "This isn't why I'm here. This is about my son." His words were soft but firm, redirecting the focus to Nathan. The veterans nodded, respecting his wish, but their presence remained a wall of support around him. Harold, now alone in his defiance, seemed to shrink. The crowd's mood had shifted decisively. Disapproval and hostility replaced curiosity. A woman in a floral dress stood, her voice sharp. "Let the man sit. He's earned it." Others murmured agreement, and a low clap started in the back, spreading like wildfire. Harold's face was now a deep crimson, his authority in tatters. Edward, unable to bear the pressure, finally broke. "Harold, I'm done," he said, his voice shaking as he ripped off his badge and dropped it to the floor. "This is wrong, and you know it." He turned to John, his eyes filled with shame. "Sir, I'm sorry. This never should have happened." Without waiting for a response, Edward pushed past the veterans and headed for the exit, his footsteps echoing in the near-silent auditorium. Harold stood alone, his pride the only thing keeping him from following. The crowd's applause grew louder, a wave of support for John that drowned out Harold's faltering resolve. But before the situation could escalate further, the auditorium lights dimmed, and a voice crackled over the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The graduation ceremony will begin in 5 minutes. Please welcome our distinguished students to the stage." The announcement was a lifeline, a reminder of the evening's true purpose. The veterans began to disperse, taking seats around John, forming an impromptu honor guard. Harold, now isolated, faced a choice: retreat or double down. His hand hovered over his phone, but the weight of the crowd's judgment and the veteran's presence made the decision for him. He stepped back, muttering something inaudible, and retreated to the edge of the aisle. As the crowd settled, the auditorium doors opened once more. This time, it wasn't a veteran, but a young man in graduation robes. Nathan Carter stepped into the room, his brow furrowed with confusion. He spotted his father standing in the aisle, surrounded by men whose bearing screamed military. "Dad," he called, his voice carrying across the now quiet auditorium. "What's going on?" John's heart clenched at the sight of his son. Nathan's robes, the tassel on his cap, the pride in his eyes, it was everything John had worked for. He stepped toward Nathan, his voice low but steady. "Just a misunderstanding, son. Nothing to worry about." Nathan wasn't convinced. He looked at the veterans, then back at his father. "Why are all these guys here? What's happening?" Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his voice gentle but authoritative. "Son, your father is a genuine American hero." The words hit Nathan like a revelation, his eyes widening as he processed them. He'd always known his father was a Marine, but the details had been locked away, dismissed as old history whenever he asked. Now, surrounded by men who revered John, Nathan began to see his father in a new light. The auditorium at Lincoln High School was now a stage for more than just a graduation ceremony. The tension that had gripped the 3rd row had spread, drawing every eye to John Carter and the circle of veterans who stood as his silent defenders. Nathan Carter, in his valedictorian robes, stood frozen, his eyes darting between his father and the men who had just declared John a hero. The weight of Colonel Robert Hayes' words, "Your father is a genuine American hero," hung in the air, reshaping Nathan's understanding of the man who'd raised him. The crowd, once buzzing with anticipation for the ceremony, was now captivated by the drama unfolding before them. Nathan's voice trembled slightly as he spoke, his confusion giving way to awe. "These men all served with you?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the veterans Colonel Hayes, Tom Sullivan, Mike O'Connell, Pete Larson, Sam Bennett, Chris Morgan, and David Lee. Each man nodded, their expressions a mix of pride and solemnity, their presence a testament to the bonds forged in combat. Tom Sullivan stepped forward, his voice firm but warm. "Your father saved lives, Nathan. More than any one man should have to in a lifetime. He pulled my team out of a burning building in Fallujah, under fire. He carried Chris 3 miles in Helmand with insurgents closing in. And he held the line in Ramadi so we could all get out alive." Sullivan's eyes met John's, a silent acknowledgement of shared sacrifice. He never wanted the spotlight, just to come home and be your dad. Nathan's expression softened, his eyes glistening as he looked at his father. "All these years," he said, his voice catching. "You worked 2 jobs, never complained, always put me first. I thought you were just dad. I didn't know you were a hero to all these people." John shifted uncomfortably, his natural humility clashing with the public reverence. "It wasn't about being a hero, son," he said quietly. "It was about doing what needed doing for the people who counted on me, just like I've tried to do for you." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Parents who had been annoyed by the earlier disruption now leaned forward, some wiping tears, others nodding in respect. The teenage girl with the phone was still recording, her footage likely destined for social media, where it would spark debates about respect, service, and prejudice. Harold Grayson, the lone HOA security man still standing, was a ghost of his former self, his authority dissolved in the face of John's quiet strength and the veterans' unwavering support. At that moment, Dr. Margaret Thompson, the principal of Lincoln High, approached the group. A woman in her late 50s, with a decade of leadership under her belt, she carried herself with the calm authority of someone who'd seen countless school events but none quite like this. She'd been watching from the sidelines, piecing together the confrontation's gravity. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice carrying respect, "I had no idea about your service record when we planned this ceremony." The crowd leaned in, sensing a shift. Dr. Thompson continued, "The school board and our community would be honored if you'd say a few words to our graduates tonight. Your son is our valedictorian, and having his father speak about service and sacrifice would mean the world to everyone here." John's instinct was to decline. He shook his head, his discomfort plain. The spotlight was anathema to him. He'd spent decades avoiding it, letting his actions speak where words felt unnecessary. But Nathan reached out, touching his father's arm with a gentle insistence. "Dad, please," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let them see the man I've always seen. Let them know what real strength looks like." The plea was raw, unguarded, and it struck John to his core. He looked at Nathan, seeing the pride and urgency in his son's eyes, then at the veterans, who nodded in encouragement. The crowd's expectant silence pressed in, not with judgment but with hope. For once, John felt the weight of not just his past, but the future Nathan's future, and the example he wanted to set. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. "Just a few words," he said, his voice barely audible but resolute. Nathan's face lit up, relief and pride mingling in his expression. Dr. Thompson smiled, recognizing the courage it took for John to step into a role he'd long avoided. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said, gesturing toward the stage. As John followed Dr. Thompson, the veterans took their seats around the third row, their presence a quiet honor guard. Harold Grayson, now utterly alone, slunk to the edge of the aisle, his phone forgotten, his authority shattered. The crowd's earlier applause resumed, soft at first, then swelling as John climbed the stage steps. Nathan returned to the backstage area, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and nervous anticipation for his father's speech. The journey to the podium felt endless, each step heavy with memory-soft Kandahar's burning wreckage, Fallujah's sniper fire, Ramadi's desperate extraction. John had walked through hell to save others, but this walk, under the gaze of hundreds, was its own trial. As he reached the microphone, the auditorium fell silent, every eye on the man in the worn white shirt and khaki pants, a man who'd never sought glory but stood now as its reluctant recipient. John stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edges, grounding himself. The sea of faces, parents, students, teachers, veterans waited, their silence a canvas for his words. He glanced at Nathan, now seated in the front row with the other graduates, his cap slightly askew, his eyes shining with pride. It gave John the strength to begin. 20 years ago, he said, his voice steady but soft, someone told me heroes aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who get up, no matter how hard it gets, and keep going because it's right. He paused, letting the words settle. Not for glory, not for praise, but because someone has to stand when others can't. Because the mission matters more than the man. The crowd was still, his words resonating with a truth that transcended the auditorium. John's eyes moved across the faces, finding the veterans, then Nathan, then the students waiting backstage. These graduates, he continued, gesturing toward the stage's wings, they're the real heroes. They're your future. They'll carry the values that make this country worth fighting for, the principles that build communities worth living in. His voice grew stronger, more confident. Strength isn't about shouting or drawing attention. It's about staying true when the world tries to break you. It's about dignity in chaos, values in uncertainty. The crowd leaned in, some parents nodding, students listening with a focus rare for graduation speeches. John's authenticity, his quiet authority, cut through the usual platitudes. Keep your dignity, he said, addressing the graduates directly now. Hold your values tight. Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong where you've earned your place through hard work, good character, and service to others. The words landed with force, their simplicity belying their depth. The crowd erupted in applause, not polite but heartfelt, a wave of respect that washed over John. He stepped back from the podium, his discomfort returning but tempered by the knowledge that he'd done this for Nathan, for the graduates, for the values he'd lived by. The applause in the Lincoln High School auditorium swelled, a tidal wave of respect and admiration that enveloped John Carter as he stepped back from the podium. His words, simple yet profound, had struck a chord, resonating with parents, students, and teachers alike. The graduates, waiting backstage, stood a little taller, their faces reflecting a newfound understanding of the values John had spoken of: dignity, service, and resilience. Nathan Carter, seated in the front row among his fellow seniors, beamed with pride, his eyes locked on his father, the man he'd always known as a quiet carpenter now revealed as a hero. John descended the stage steps, each one feeling lighter than the climb up. The veterans Colonel Robert Hayes, Tom Sullivan, Mike O'Connell, Pete Larson, Sam Bennett, Chris Morgan, and David Leasted as he approached, their applause leading the crowds. Their presence, a silent honor guard, had transformed the third row into a symbol of respect earned through sacrifice. Harold Grayson, the HOA security man who'd sparked the confrontation, was nowhere to be seen, having slipped out during John's speech, his pride shattered by the weight of his misjudgment. Dr. Margaret Thompson, the principal, took the podium to begin the formal ceremony, but the energy in the room had shifted. The confrontation, the veterans' testimonials, and John's speech had woven a narrative of courage and dignity that overshadowed the usual pomp of graduation. As the students' names were called, the crowd's applause for each graduate carried an extra layer of warmth, as if John's words had reminded them of the potential for heroism in every young person crossing the stage. Nathan's moment came, his name announced as valedictorian. Nathan James Carter, Dr. Thompson said, her voice tinged with pride. The crowd erupted, the loudest applause of the night, not just for Nathan's academic achievement, but for the father who'd raised him. John stood, his phone ready to capture the moment, his heart swelling as Nathan walked across the stage, his smile radiant. Their eyes met briefly, a silent exchange of love and understanding that needed no words. As Nathan delivered his valedictorian address, his voice steady and confident, he echoed themes from his father's speech: resilience, community, and the importance of standing for what's right. My dad taught me that true strength isn't loud, Nathan said, glancing at John. It's in the quiet choices we make every day to do what's right, even when it's hard. The crowd nodded, some dabbing at their eyes, the connection between father and son palpable. The ceremony concluded with the traditional cap toss, a burst of color and joy that filled the auditorium. Families spilled onto the gymnasium floor, hugging their graduates, snapping photos, and sharing stories. John stood with Nathan, the veterans gathering around them, their laughter and reminiscences a stark contrast to the earlier tension. You did good, kid, Tom Sullivan said to Nathan, clapping him on the shoulder. Your old man's got a lot to be proud of. John smiled, his discomfort with attention easing in the warmth of the moment. I'm the one who's proud, he said, pulling Nathan into a hug. The crowd around them buzzed with conversation, some parents approaching John to shake his hand, others thanking the veterans for their service. The teenage girl who'd recorded the confrontation was now posting her video online, its caption reading, "A real hero shut down fake cops at my school's graduation. Respect veterans." 6 months later, John sat on the porch of his modest home in suburban Virginia, the late autumn sun casting long shadows across his neatly trimmed lawn. A framed photo from the graduation sat on the table beside him, capturing him at the podium, Nathan in the front row, surrounded by the veterans who'd stood by his side. Nathan, now thriving at Stanford, sent regular updates, photos of his dorm, stories of late-night study sessions, and promises to call more often. Each message carried a trace of the lessons learned that June evening, a quiet acknowledgement of the values John had instilled. The incident at Lincoln High had rippled through the community in ways John hadn't expected. Harold Grayson resigned from the Homeowners Association after multiple families filed complaints, their outrage fueled by the local newspaper's feature on veterans' contributions. The article, titled "Unsung Heroes Among Us," highlighted John's story without his input, declined all interviews, letting his actions speak louder than any headline. Social media amplified the story, with the teenage girl's video garnering thousands of views, sparking debates about prejudice, authority, and the treatment of veterans. The community response was overwhelming. A local veterans group organized a scholarship in John's name, funding education for children of service members. Parents at Lincoln High started a petition to ensure school events were free of HOA overreach, a nod to the absurdity of Harold's reserved seating claim. John, true to form, stayed out of the spotlight, focusing on his carpentry work and the occasional fishing trip with friends from his old unit. As he sat on his porch, John touched the watch on his wrist, a keepsake from his late wife, Ellen. "We did good," he whispered, thinking of Nathan and the life they'd built together. The values he'd lived by, duty, dignity, and quiet strength, had taken root in his son, a legacy more enduring than any medal or headline. The story of that night wasn't just about one man's stand against petty injustice. It was about a community reminded of the sacrifices that bind it, the courage that defines it, and the quiet heroes who walk among us, asking for nothing but the chance to live with dignity. John Carter had proven that strength doesn't shout, it stands, unwavering, in the face of adversity, and its echo carries far beyond a single auditorium. John Carter's story is a powerful reminder of the battles fought not just on distant battlefields, but in the everyday moments where dignity and respect are tested. It challenges us to confront the injustices we witness, whether they stem from prejudice, misused authority, or simple ignorance. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you encountered or witnessed moments of injustice in your own life? How do you respond when faced with disrespect or discrimination? Do you believe standing up, as John did, is always worth the fight, or are there times when walking away is the stronger choice? Share your perspective, and let's spark a conversation about courage, community, and the values that shape us. Your voice matters, let it be heard.